The North American continent encompasses an area of approximately 24 million square kilometers. Within that area, environments range from Arctic tundra to tropical lowland, from interior desert basin to temperate rainforest. Coastlines extend along two major oceans. River systems drain millions of square kilometers of interior land. During the late Pleistocene and into the Holocene, these environments were not static. They shifted, contracted, expanded, and reorganized in response to global climatic forces. The archaeological record left within this landscape is fragmentary, unevenly preserved, and still incompletely understood. What it does reveal is a long and complex record of human presence and adaptation. North America's environmental diversity is among the most pronounced of any continental landmass on Earth. This diversity was not incidental to prehistoric human life. It was the primary condition that determined where people could live, what they could eat, how they moved, and how their material culture developed over thousands of years. The continent's geography can be divided into several broad zones, each with distinct ecological characteristics. Along the Pacific coast, a narrow coastal plain runs from what is now southern Alaska down through present-day California and into the Baja Peninsula. This coastal strip is backed almost immediately by mountain ranges, including the Coast Ranges and the Sierra Nevada in the west, and the Cascade Range further north. These ranges create a sharp environmental gradient. West of the mountains, precipitation is relatively high, and temperate or Mediterranean climates prevail depending on latitude. East of the ranges, precipitation drops sharply. The interior plateaus and basins of the Great Basin region receive among the lowest annual rainfall of anywhere on the continent. In some areas, annual precipitation averages below 150 millimeters. The Rocky Mountain system forms a second major spine, running roughly north to south through the interior of the continent. This range, which extends from present-day New Mexico northward into Canada and connects with ranges further into Alaska, created significant barriers to east-west movement while also providing resource-rich montane environments at various elevations. Alpine zones above the tree line provided seasonal grazing for large mammals. Lower foothills and river valleys offered more moderate conditions year-round. East of the Rockies, the landscape opens into the vast interior plains. These grasslands extended across millions of square kilometers and were, during the late Pleistocene, home to megafauna assemblages that included mammoth, mastodon, ancient bison, horse, camel, and ground sloth, among others. The productivity of these grasslands was driven by seasonal precipitation patterns and by the vast herds of grazing animals that maintained them. The plains were not uniform. Northern sections experienced more severe winters and shorter growing seasons. Southern sections graded into semi-arid shrublands, and further south into the Chihuahuan and Sonoran desert systems. To the east, the Appalachian Mountain System forms a much older and more eroded range, running from present-day Georgia northward into New England and continuing into Atlantic Canada. East of the Appalachians, a broad coastal plain extends to the Atlantic seaboard. This plain includes extensive wetland systems, estuaries, and barrier islands. The richness of these coastal and estuarine environments made them productive zones for prehistoric subsistence, though the archaeological record along much of the Atlantic coast has been significantly affected by sea level rise since the end of the Pleistocene. Sites that were once inland or coastal are now submerged on the continental shelf. The southeastern interior was dominated by mixed deciduous and pine forest, interspersed with river floodplains and swamp systems. The Mississippi River and its tributaries form the largest river drainage system in North America, connecting environments from the northern plains to the Gulf of Mexico. This river system functioned as a major corridor for both animal movement and, eventually, human movement and exchange. Floodplain environments along major rivers were among the most productive in the continent for prehistoric subsistence, providing access to fish, waterfowl, plant foods, and terrestrial game within relatively compact areas. The Great Lakes region, shaped by glacial activity during the Pleistocene, contains the largest concentration of freshwater on Earth. During the late glacial period, this region was dramatically different from its present configuration. Glacial lakes were larger, drainage patterns were different, and much of the land was recently deglaciated and ecologically unstable. As the ice retreated northward over several millennia, forests advanced, soils developed, and animal communities reorganized. Human populations followed these shifting ecological frontiers. Climate was a defining variable throughout the prehistoric period. During the last glacial maximum, approximately 26,000 to 19,000 years before present, ice sheets covered much of northern North America. The Laurentide ice sheet extended southward into what is now the northern United States. A separate Cordilleran ice sheet covered much of the Pacific Northwest and merged at times with the Laurentide system, potentially blocking interior movement between Alaska and the rest of the continent. Sea levels were substantially lower than today, exposing the continental shelf along both coasts and creating the land connection known as Beringia between northeastern Asia and northwestern North America. As glacial conditions began to relax after approximately 19,000 years before present, ice sheets retreated, sea levels rose, and ecological zones reorganized across the continent. This transition was not uniform or linear. It involved periods of rapid warming, temporary reversals such as the Younger Dryas cooling event between approximately 12,900 and 11,700 years before present, and significant regional variation. The reorganization of plant communities lagged behind climate shifts, and animal populations responded to both climate and vegetation changes on their own timescales. By the early Holocene, beginning roughly 11,700 years before present, most of the continent had taken on ecological configurations broadly recognizable in comparison to the present, though significant differences remained. The mid-Holocene hypsothermal period, roughly between 9,000 and 5,000 years before present, brought warmer and in many regions drier conditions than today. This period placed significant stress on water-dependent ecosystems and altered the distribution of plant and animal resources across large areas. Later, Holocene cooling and increased moisture in some regions allowed for expansion of certain ecosystems and resource bases. Rivers, lakes, and coastal zones were not simply geographic features, they were the primary organizing structures of prehistoric settlement. Evidence consistently indicates that human occupation was concentrated near reliable water sources. Interior desert regions were not uninhabited, but occupation there was typically more mobile, more seasonal, and less archaeologically visible than occupation along rivers or coasts. Mountainous zones show evidence of seasonal use, with groups moving to higher elevations in warmer months to exploit specific resources and descending to lower elevations during winter. The diversity of North American environments created conditions in which no single subsistence strategy could apply across the continent. Populations adapted to local conditions over long periods, developing distinct technological repertoires, settlement patterns, and resource procurement strategies. The environmental framework described here is the foundation upon which all subsequent prehistoric human activity on the continent must be understood. Archaeologists working across North America consistently return to environmental data, including pollen records, faunal assemblages, isotope analyses, and sediment cores, to contextualize the material remains of prehistoric human populations within the landscapes that shaped them. North America, at the time of European contact, supported a human population whose size remains debated among researchers. Estimates have ranged widely, from approximately 2 million to over 18 million individuals north of present-day Mexico, with most contemporary scholars situating their estimates somewhere between 3 and 7 million for the period immediately preceding contact. These figures reflect not a single unified population, but hundreds of distinct groups speaking different languages, organized according to different social principles, and adapted to radically different environmental conditions. The prehistoric record underlying these contact-era populations extends back at least 13,000 years by conservative archaeological consensus, and potentially considerably longer, depending on how pre-Clovis evidence is interpreted. The organizational diversity of prehistoric North American populations was substantial. At the broadest level, archaeologists distinguish between band-level societies, tribal or village-level societies, and chiefdom-level societies, though these categories are understood as heuristic frameworks rather than rigid classifications. Band-level organization, characterized by small, mobile, kin-based groups without formal hereditary leadership, appears to represent the dominant social form during the earliest periods of human occupation on the continent and persisted in many regions into the late prehistoric and historic periods. In environments where resources were dispersed, unpredictable, or available only seasonally, high residential mobility and flexible group composition were adaptive responses. Small groups could move efficiently, aggregate when resources permitted, and disperse when they did not. As certain regions developed more reliable or concentrated resource bases, more sedentary and more complex social arrangements became viable. Along the Pacific Northwest coast, rich marine and riverine environments supported relatively dense, sedentary populations with complex social hierarchies, hereditary leadership, and elaborate material culture, though the deepest roots of this complexity are difficult to trace archaeologically. In the eastern woodlands, the emergence of mound-building traditions and evidence of long-distance exchange networks indicate increasing social complexity in the mid to late prehistoric period. In the southwest, agricultural villages with substantial architectural investment appeared in the last few millennia before contact. These regional developments were not universal trends, but responses to specific local conditions and histories. Population estimates for prehistoric periods are considerably more uncertain than those for the contact era. Archaeologists use several indirect proxies to estimate population size and density, including site counts, site sizes, the density of archaeological features within sites, and isotopic evidence from human remains. These methods carry significant margins of error and are subject to preservation biases. Sites in well-drained upland areas may preserve better than those in floodplains or coastal zones. Regions with longer histories of archaeological research yield more site data than less studied areas. These biases mean that population reconstructions must be treated as approximations rather than precise figures. During the earliest periods of human occupation, population levels across the continent were almost certainly low. The initial colonizing populations, however they arrived and by whatever route, would have been small in absolute numbers. Demographic modeling based on ethnographic analogs and genetic data suggests that founding populations may have been in the hundreds to low thousands of individuals. Growth rates during the initial colonization phase are unknown but were likely constrained by the challenges of adapting to new and varied environments. Over millennia, as populations established themselves in specific regions and developed effective local subsistence strategies, numbers grew, though the rate and trajectory of that growth varied considerably by region and time period. Genetic evidence has contributed significantly to understanding the deep population history of North America. Studies of mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome variation, and more recently whole genome sequencing have helped clarify patterns of migration, population structure, and divergence among prehistoric groups. The broad consensus from genetic research supports a primary colonization of the Americas from northeastern Asia, likely via Beringia, though the timing, number of migration events, and subsequent population dynamics remain subjects of active investigation. Some genetic studies suggest a period of population isolation in Beringia before the movement southward into the Americas, a hypothesis sometimes referred to as the Beringian standstill model. Other research points to more complex patterns involving multiple movements and subsequent gene flow. Social organization in prehistoric North America was not static. Groups that were highly mobile during one period might become more sedentary as environmental conditions or subsistence strategies changed. Evidence from burial assemblages, settlement patterns, and material culture distributions indicates that social relationships were maintained across considerable distances through exchange networks, intermarriage, and periodic aggregation. These networks were not incidental to prehistoric social life. They were mechanisms for managing risk, accessing distant resources, transmitting technological knowledge, and maintaining social ties that could be activated in times of local resource failure. Kinship was almost certainly the fundamental organizing principle of social life throughout most of the prehistoric period in most regions. In small, mobile, band-level societies, kinship ties defined access to resources, obligations of sharing, and alliances with neighboring groups. The specific forms of kinship reckoning, whether patrilineal, matrilineal, or bilateral, cannot be directly recovered from the archaeological record in most cases, though burial patterns and residential configurations occasionally provide indirect evidence. In later periods, where population densities increased and social hierarchies became more pronounced, kinship systems likely became more formalized and their social and economic implications more consequential. Conflict between groups is documented in the prehistoric record of North America, though its frequency, scale, and causes varied considerably across regions and time periods. Skeletal evidence of traumatic injury, site locations chosen for defensive advantages, and the presence of palisade features around villages in certain regions all indicate that interpersonal and intergroup violence was a recurring feature of prehistoric life in at least some areas and periods. The scale of this violence rarely approached what might be called warfare in a formal sense during the earliest periods, but evidence from the late prehistoric period in certain regions suggests more organized and sustained conflict. The causes of such conflict are debated. Resource stress, population pressure, competition over trade routes, and social dynamics internal to specific cultural traditions have all been proposed as contributing factors. Exchange and interaction between groups were consistent features of the prehistoric record from early periods onward. Marine shell found hundreds of kilometers from the nearest coast, obsidian tools sourced to specific volcanic outcrops far from their find locations, and copper artifacts distributed across wide geographic areas all indicate that prehistoric populations maintained contact and conducted exchange over long distances. These exchange networks were not purely economic in a modern sense. They were embedded in social relationships and likely carried symbolic and political dimensions alongside their material functions. The distribution of prestige goods through exchange networks is frequently associated in the archaeological record with the emergence or reinforcement of social differentiation, as access to rare or distant materials could signal status, reinforce alliances, or validate leadership claims. The question of when humans first arrived in North America is among the most debated in the archaeological literature. For much of the 20th century, the dominant framework held that the first Americans were the Clovis people, a population identified by a distinctive fluted projectile point technology that appears in the archaeological record at sites distributed across much of North America. Clovis points were first formally identified at a site near Clovis, New Mexico, in the 1930s, where they were found in association with mammoth remains. Subsequent research established a Clovis horizon dating to approximately 13,000 to 12,700 years before present, appearing with relative suddenness across a wide geographic range. For decades, the Clovis first hypothesis held that these people represented the founding population of the Americas, having entered the continent from northeastern Asia via the Beringian land connection and moved southward through an ice-free corridor that opened between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets as glacial conditions retreated. The Clovis first model has been substantially challenged over the past several decades by accumulating evidence from sites that predate the Clovis horizon. The most significant of these is Monteverde in southern Chile, excavated by Tom Dillahay and his colleagues and dated to approximately 14,500 to 15,000 years before present. The site preserved organic materials including wood, plant remains, and possible architectural features under waterlogged conditions that inhibited decomposition. The antiquity and integrity of Monteverde were initially contested, but are now accepted by most researchers. The geographic location of Monteverde, at the southern tip of South America, implies that human populations must have been present in North America considerably earlier than the Clovis horizon in order to have reached that latitude by the time the site was occupied. Several North American sites have also produced evidence interpreted as predating Clovis. The Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania has yielded dates suggesting human occupation potentially as early as 16,000 years before present, though the dating has been contested on grounds of possible contamination. The Paisley Caves in Oregon produced human coprolites, fossilized fecal material, with ancient DNA confirmed as human and dated to approximately 14,300 years before present, predating the Clovis horizon. The Deborah L. Friedkin site in Texas has yielded lithic assemblages below Clovis age deposits, with dates suggested between 15,000 and 20,000 years before present, though these dates and their association with human activity remain subjects of ongoing scrutiny. The Chiquihuite Cave site in Mexico produced lithic artifacts in deposits dated to potentially 26,000 years before present or earlier, though this interpretation is contested and not yet broadly accepted. The accumulation of pre-Clovis evidence has shifted the consensus among many researchers away from a strict Clovis first position. The current debate centers not on whether pre-Clovis populations existed, but on when they arrived, by what route, and what relationship they bore to later populations. Two primary migration routes have been proposed. The interior ice-free corridor route postulates movement southward through a gap between the ice sheets as they retreated. However, ecological modeling and sediment core data suggest that this corridor may not have been biologically viable, meaning sufficiently vegetated and stocked with game to support human movement until approximately 13,000 years before present, too late to account for pre-Clovis sites further south. This has directed increasing attention toward a coastal migration route. The coastal migration hypothesis proposes that people moved southward along the Pacific coastline of North America, potentially using watercraft to navigate around glaciated sections of coast and exploiting marine and coastal resources along the way. This route would have been accessible earlier than the interior corridor and would have allowed relatively rapid movement southward along the coast and into South America. The primary obstacle to evaluating this hypothesis archaeologically is that the coastline along which migration would have occurred is now largely submerged. Sea levels during the late Pleistocene were significantly lower than today, and the coastal shelf that would have been exposed at that time now lies under tens to hundreds of meters of ocean water. Submerged site survey and underwater archaeology in these areas is technically challenging and has so far produced limited direct evidence, though research efforts are ongoing. Genetic evidence bears on this question as well. Whole genome studies of ancient and modern indigenous American populations generally support a primary colonization from northeastern Asia, with most analyses suggesting that the ancestral population of Native Americans diverged from related Asian populations somewhere between 25,000 and 20,000 years before present. Some studies identify signatures of additional gene flow events, suggesting that the population history of the Americas may have involved more than one migration or subsequent contact with Asian populations. A genetic signal associated with populations in Australasia has been identified in some Amazonian groups and in ancient skeletal material from Brazil, suggesting a more complex colonization history than a single migration event would explain. Though the mechanisms by which this signal arrived in South America remain uncertain. The distribution of Clovis sites across North America reflects both the actual geographic range of Clovis populations and the preservation and discovery biases that affect the archaeological record. Clovis points have been found from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic seaboard and from Canada into Central America. However, the density of Clovis finds is uneven. The Great Plains and the Southwest have produced substantial numbers of Clovis sites, in part because conditions for preservation and surface exposure of sites are favorable in those regions. The eastern United States has also produced Clovis material, though often in contexts that make precise dating difficult. The Pacific coast and the far north have yielded comparatively little Clovis material, which is consistent with either actual absence or poor preservation and limited research coverage. The subsistence behavior of Clovis populations has been inferred primarily from kill sites, where Clovis points occur in association with the remains of large mammals. Mammoth kill or butchery sites are among the most well-documented Clovis associations, with sites such as Lanner Ranch and Murray Springs in Arizona providing clear evidence of mammoth processing. Ancient bison, mastodon, and other megafauna are also represented at Clovis-associated sites. Whether Clovis people were specialized big game hunters, or whether large mammal hunting was one component of a broader subsistence strategy is debated. The archaeological visibility of megafauna kill sites is high relative to sites associated with plant gathering or small animal procurement, which may skew the apparent emphasis on large game in the Clovis record. The disappearance of North American megafauna at the end of the Pleistocene, roughly coinciding with the Clovis period, has generated sustained debate. The overkill hypothesis, associated primarily with Paul Martin, proposes that human hunting pressure was the primary cause of megafauna extinction. Critics of this hypothesis point to the coincidence of extinction with major climatic and environmental changes at the end of the Pleistocene, arguing that habitat disruption and vegetation change were equally or more important factors. A third hypothesis implicates a cosmic impact event, proposed on the basis of geochemical anomalies found at a stratigraphic horizon corresponding to approximately 12,900 years before present, the onset of the Younger Dryas cooling event. This impact hypothesis remains contested, with researchers disagreeing about the interpretation of the proposed impact markers. The extinction of megafauna, whatever its cause, had profound consequences for subsequent human populations, eliminating the largest prey animals and requiring adaptation to a fauna composed primarily of smaller species. The archaeological record of prehistoric North America is known primarily through a collection of excavated sites that vary enormously in their preservation, research history, and the range of materials they have yielded. No single site provides a complete picture of prehistoric life. Instead, researchers draw on evidence from hundreds of localities, integrating data across regions and time periods to construct broader interpretations. Some sites have been central to defining entire cultural periods or technological traditions. Others have contributed specific classes of evidence, such as faunal remains, botanical material, or human skeletal data, that fill gaps in the record. What follows is a survey of key sites and site types that have shaped current understanding of prehistoric North American populations. The Clovis Age sites of the American Southwest remain among the most thoroughly documented localities in the continental record. Murray Springs in southeastern Arizona was excavated by C. Vance Haynes beginning in the 1960s and produced evidence of mammoth butchery, ancient bison kill events, and a black mat, a dark organic sediment layer that appears across many southwestern sites and marks the stratigraphic boundary between Pleistocene and early Holocene deposits. At Murray Springs, Clovis points, blade tools, and bone artifacts were recovered in direct association with mammoth and bison remains. The site also preserved a section of what researchers interpret as a mammoth trail, a series of impressions in ancient sediment suggesting the animal's movement before death. Lanner Ranch, also in Arizona, produced 13 Clovis points along with butchering tools and the remains of at least 13 mammoths, 2 horses, a tapir, and bison. Radiocarbon dates from Lanner Ranch place the occupation at approximately 13,000 years before present. The Lindenmeyer site in northern Colorado represents a different class of early site. Excavated during the 1930s, Lindenmeyer produced an extensive assemblage of Folsom Age material dating to approximately 10,800 to 10,200 years before present. Folsom culture, which postdates Clovis, is defined by a distinctive fluted point technology applied to a smaller and more finely worked projectile point than the Clovis form. Folsom points are found primarily in the Great Plains and Rocky Mountain foothills and are consistently associated with the remains of an extinct species of bison, Bison antiquus, which was larger than modern bison. Lindenmeyer yielded thousands of artifacts, including points, scrapers, gravers, and worked bone, along with evidence suggesting repeated occupation of the site over multiple seasons or years. The density and diversity of the assemblage led researchers to interpret Lindenmeyer as a relatively large aggregation site where multiple band-level groups may have gathered periodically. The Paisley Caves in south-central Oregon have become increasingly important to debates about early human presence on the continent. Excavated by Dennis Jenkins and colleagues, the caves produced coprolites, plant remains, animal bones, and lithic artifacts across a long stratigraphic sequence. The human coprolites yielding ancient DNA dated to approximately 14,300 years before present represent some of the most securely dated pre-Clovis evidence in North America. The lithic assemblage from the pre-Clovis levels at Paisley does not conform to the Clovis technological tradition, which has contributed to arguments that multiple technological traditions were present on the continent before or alongside the Clovis horizon. The caves continued to be used by human populations through the Holocene, providing a long sequence of occupation data for the northern Great Basin region. The Galt site in central Texas has produced one of the largest Clovis assemblages known, with over 600,000 artifacts recovered from Clovis Age deposits. The site also yielded material from stratigraphic levels below the Clovis horizon, including what researchers have described as a distinct lithic technology predating Clovis and dated to between 16,000 and 20,000 years before present. The Galt assemblage has contributed substantially to understanding the range of tool types produced within the Clovis technological system, including not only the distinctive fluted points, but also blades, blade cores, burins, and engraved stones. The engraved stones from Galt, bearing geometric designs, are among the oldest examples of graphic or symbolic behavior documented in North America, though their precise interpretation remains uncertain. Along the Pacific coast, the Channel Islands off the coast of present-day California have yielded evidence of early human occupation dating to approximately 13,000 years before present. Arlington Springs Man, skeletal remains recovered from Santa Rosa Island, was originally dated to around 13,000 years before present, making it one of the oldest human skeletal finds in North America. The Channel Islands were not islands during the late Pleistocene in the same configuration as today. Lower sea levels meant that the northern islands formed a single larger landmass, though even then they were separated from the mainland by a channel requiring water crossing. The presence of humans on the Channel Islands at this early date implies watercraft capability, supporting arguments for a coastal migration or coastal adapted early population. The Kennewick Man find in Washington state, skeletal remains discovered along the Columbia River in 1996 and dated to approximately 8,500 to 9,000 years before present, generated significant scientific and legal debate. The morphology of the skull was described by some physical anthropologists as differing from the morphology typical of later Native American populations, prompting suggestions of population diversity or replacement in the early Holocene. Subsequent ancient DNA analysis conducted after legal disputes over custody of the remains were resolved identified Kennewick Man as most closely related to contemporary Native American populations of the region, tempering earlier claims of population discontinuity. The case highlighted both the scientific value of ancient skeletal material and the complex legal and ethical framework surrounding such remains in the United States. In the eastern United States, the Page-Ladson site in Florida represents a submerged Pleistocene-age locality, excavated in the Osceola River. The site produced a mastodon tusk with cut marks interpreted as evidence of human butchery, along with stone tools, dated to approximately 14,500 years before present. The underwater context of Page-Ladson is significant because it demonstrates that submerged sites can yield well-preserved and datable evidence of early human activity, and it supports arguments that the southeastern coastal plain, much of which is now submerged, was inhabited during the late Pleistocene. The site also produced a depositional sequence spanning the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, allowing researchers to track environmental and faunal change through the extinction event. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in southwestern Pennsylvania, excavated by James Adivasio beginning in the 1970s, has produced one of the longest and most debated stratigraphic sequences in eastern North American archaeology. The lowest cultural levels at Meadowcroft have been dated by radiocarbon to potentially 16,000 years before present or earlier, which would make it the oldest documented site in eastern North America. The dates have been questioned by researchers who suggest that contamination by ancient carbon from coal-bearing geological formations in the region may have artificially inflated the apparent age of the samples. Adivasio and colleagues have responded to these critiques at length, and the debate remains unresolved to general satisfaction. Regardless of the ultimate interpretation of its earliest levels, Meadowcroft provides a detailed record of occupation spanning from the late Pleistocene through the late Prehistoric period, making it one of the most complete site sequences in the Eastern record. Shell middens, accumulations of shellfish remains deposited by human groups over extended periods, represent a distinct and widespread site type along both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts and along major interior waterways. These sites often preserve organic materials including bone, plant remains, and occasionally human burials that would not survive in other depositional contexts. The acidity of decomposing shell can damage bone in some cases, but the alkaline environment created by shell deposits more frequently acts to preserve faunal material. Shell-midden sites along the California coast, the Gulf Coast, and the Atlantic seaboard have been fundamental to reconstructing coastal subsistence economies and, through the human burials they contain, prehistoric health, diet, and social organization. Many shell-midden sites show evidence of repeated occupation over centuries or millennia, indicating that productive shellfish beds were recognized as reliable and economically significant resources and were returned to consistently. The subsistence economies of prehistoric North American populations were shaped by the intersection of available resources, technological capabilities, and the organizational structures of the groups exploiting them. No single subsistence pattern characterized the continent as a whole. Instead, regional economies developed in response to local ecological conditions, and these economies shifted over time as environments changed, technologies developed, and population densities increased. What the archaeological record consistently demonstrates across regions and periods is that prehistoric subsistence was rarely simple. It required detailed environmental knowledge, significant labor investment, and flexible strategies capable of responding to seasonal and interannual variation in resource availability. The hunting of large mammals represents the most archaeologically visible component of early prehistoric subsistence in North America. Kill sites and butchery localities preserve faunal remains in association with stone tools in ways that allow relatively direct inference about hunting behavior. During the late Pleistocene, the fauna available to human hunters included species no longer present on the continent. Mammoth and mastodon, both proboscideans of substantial body mass, were present across much of the continent in appropriate habitats. Ancient bison, larger than their modern counterparts, ranged across the plains and into adjacent regions. Horses and camels, both of which evolved in North America but went extinct at the end of the Pleistocene, were also present. Ground sloths, some of enormous size, inhabited a range of environments. The hunting of these animals where it occurred would have provided large quantities of meat, fat, hide, bone, and other materials from single procurement events. The methods by which Clovis and other early hunters took large game are not directly observable, but can be inferred from site evidence. At bison kill sites on the Great Plains, the arrangement of skeletal remains and associated artifacts sometimes indicates that animals were driven into natural traps, such as arroyos, gullies, or bog margins where their mobility was compromised. The Folsom Age Lipscomb site in Texas and the Olson-Chubbuck site in Colorado, the latter dating to approximately 10,000 years before present, both show evidence of bison drives in which large numbers of animals were killed and processed in single events. At Olson-Chubbuck, the remains of nearly 200 bison were recovered from an arroyo into which the animals appear to have been driven. The butchery pattern visible in the skeletal arrangement indicated that hunters processed animals systematically, with those at the top of the pile butchered most completely, and those at the bottom, presumably less accessible, left with more meat-bearing bones intact. As megafauna declined and disappeared through the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene, subsistence economies across the continent underwent significant reorganization. The early Holocene period, sometimes referred to in North American archaeology as the Archaic, saw increasing diversification of subsistence strategies. Hunting continued, directed primarily at deer, elk, pronghorn, mountain sheep, rabbits, and other species that survived the Pleistocene extinctions, but plant foods, small game, fish, shellfish, and other resources assumed greater relative importance in most regions. This broadening of the subsistence base is sometimes described as a shift toward a more generalized foraging economy, though the specific configurations varied enormously by region. Plant foods were almost certainly important components of prehistoric diets from the earliest periods of occupation, even if they are underrepresented in the archaeological record relative to faunal remains. Plant material preserves less reliably than bone, and the tools associated with plant processing, ground stone implements such as manos and metates, mortars and pestles, are more durable than the plant remains themselves. Flotation recovery techniques, which involve processing sediment samples in water to recover charred seeds and other small plant remains, have significantly improved archaeologists' ability to document plant use at prehistoric sites. These techniques have demonstrated that seeds, nuts, roots, tubers, berries, and leafy plants were exploited across a wide range of environments and time periods. In the Great Basin, where arid conditions limited large game populations and surface water was scarce and seasonally variable, plant foods formed a particularly significant component of the diet. Pinyon pine nuts were a critical late-fall resource across much of the region, providing high-calorie, storable food that could sustain populations through winter months. Seeds of grasses and other plants were harvested, processed with grinding stones, and consumed as flour or porridge. Small seeds required substantial processing labor. Experimental studies have demonstrated that harvesting and processing sufficient grass seeds to provide a meaningful caloric contribution involves hours of labor per kilogram of usable food. The grinding tools found in abundance at Great Basin sites reflect this labor investment. The distribution of grinding stone sites across the landscape correlates with the distribution of seed-producing plants, indicating that plant harvesting locations were revisited systematically. Acorns were among the most nutritionally significant plant foods in regions where oak trees were abundant, particularly in California and parts of the eastern deciduous forest zone. Acorns contain high levels of tannins that make them bitter and potentially harmful if consumed without processing. Leaching, the process of soaking ground acorn meal in water to remove tannins, was the primary processing method and required significant time and labor. Despite this processing burden, acorns were an exceptionally productive food source where available. A single productive oak tree could yield hundreds of kilograms of nuts in a good year. The caloric density of processed acorn meal is high, and acorns could be stored for extended periods, making them effective buffer resources against seasonal food shortages. In California, where acorn dependence reached its greatest intensity, the subsistence economy of many prehistoric groups was organized substantially around the oak woodland harvest cycle. Fishing was a major subsistence activity in regions where productive fish populations were accessible. Pacific salmon, which undertake predictable seasonal migrations into coastal rivers and streams, provided a resource of exceptional abundance and predictability along the Pacific coast and in interior river systems draining to the Pacific. At certain locations along major rivers, salmon could be taken in enormous quantities during migration runs. Weirs, stone alignments built across stream channels to intercept migrating fish, are documented archaeologically in several Pacific coastal river systems. Harpoons, lysters, and nets were likely used in salmon fishing, though organic tools preserve rarely. The smoking and drying of salmon for storage allowed groups to accumulate large quantities of preserved food during peak migration periods, supporting larger group sizes and more sedentary settlement patterns than would otherwise be possible. In the eastern United States, freshwater fish from rivers and lakes were important dietary components across much of the Archaic period and into the late prehistoric. Catfish, suckers, bass, and other species were taken using a range of techniques including hook and line, nets, traps, and weirs. Anadromous fish, including shad and sturgeon, ascended Atlantic coastal rivers seasonally in large numbers, providing periodic abundance that could be exploited intensively. Shellfish, including freshwater mussels in interior rivers and marine bivalves along the coasts, were harvested extensively. The shell-midden sites that accumulated along coastlines and riverbanks over centuries and millennia attest to the sustained economic importance of shellfish, which provided reliable if labor-intensive food sources supplementing other dietary components. Marine mammal hunting was documented in coastal regions, particularly along the Pacific coast and in the Arctic. Sea mammals, including seals, sea lions, and in later periods whales, provided substantial quantities of meat, fat, and raw materials. The fat content of marine mammals was nutritionally significant, particularly in northern environments where caloric demands were high and plant foods were limited. The technological requirements for marine mammal hunting, including boats, specialized harpoon technology, and the knowledge to navigate coastal waters safely, represent significant investments in specialized equipment and skills. The development of these technologies in coastal regions reflects long-term adaptation to marine environments rather than opportunistic exploitation. Trade networks extended the effective resource base of prehistoric groups beyond their immediate territories. Obsidian, a volcanic glass that fractures predictably and produces exceptionally sharp edges, was quarried at specific geological sources and distributed across vast areas through exchange. Obsidian from the Obsidian Cliff Source in what is now Yellowstone National Park has been found at Hopewell-associated sites in the Ohio River Valley, over 2,000 kilometers distant. Marine shell moved hundreds of kilometers into interior regions, where it was used for ornaments and possibly as a medium of exchange. Copper from deposits in the Great Lakes region was worked and distributed across the eastern woodlands. These exchanges were not merely economic transactions, but were embedded in social relationships that maintained connections between geographically distant groups, facilitated the movement of information and technology alongside material goods, and structured social obligations that could be activated in times of local resource stress. The technological repertoire of prehistoric North American populations developed over thousands of years in response to environmental demands, available raw materials, and the accumulated knowledge transmitted across generations. Technology in this context encompasses not only the tools themselves, but the knowledge systems required to produce and use them effectively. Stone tool production, the most archaeologically visible technological domain, required detailed understanding of raw material properties, controlled application of force, and learned motor skills that could take years to develop to a high level of proficiency. Other technological domains, including the production of organic tools from bone, antler, wood, and fiber, are less completely preserved, but were equally important to prehistoric subsistence and daily life. The earliest well-documented stone tool technology in North America is the Clovis lithic tradition, characterized by its distinctive fluted projectile points. Clovis points are large, bifacially worked points with a channel flake removed from one or both faces at the base, creating the flute that gives the technology its descriptive name. The functional purpose of the flute is debated. Some researchers have proposed that it facilitated hafting by thinning the base of the point for insertion into a split shaft. Others have suggested that the flute served no strictly functional purpose and may have had a social or signaling dimension, demonstrating the skill of the napper. Producing a successful Clovis point required removing the channel flake without fracturing the point, a technically demanding step that frequently resulted in failure even among experienced nappers. Experimental replication studies have documented high failure rates during the fluting step, suggesting that raw material wastage was accepted as a cost of producing the distinctive form. Clovis technology also included large bifacial knives, end scrapers, side scrapers, burins, and blade cores from which long, parallel-sided flakes were struck for use as cutting tools or as blanks for further reduction. The blade technology associated with Clovis has been compared to roughly contemporaneous blade traditions in northeastern Asia, and this technological similarity has been used to support arguments for Asian origins of the Clovis population. Though the relationship between Old World and New World blade technologies is not straightforwardly interpretable as direct derivation. Raw material selection was a significant aspect of Clovis technology. Clovis knappers consistently selected high-quality cryptocrystalline stone, including chert, flint, chalcedony, and obsidian, materials that fracture in predictable, controllable ways. The distances over which Clovis-quality raw materials were transported indicate that procurement of suitable stone was planned and deliberate, with some materials moved hundreds of kilometers from their geological sources. Following the Clovis horizon, regional technological traditions diversified considerably. The Folsom tradition of the Great Plains produced some of the most technically accomplished fluted points in the North American record. Folsom points are smaller than Clovis points and are characterized by extremely thin cross-sections and flutes that extend nearly the full length of the point on both faces. The thinness of Folsom points pushes the limits of what is mechanically achievable in flaked stone, and the skill required to produce them consistently was substantial. Folsom technology appears to have been applied almost exclusively to bison hunting on the plains, and the tight association between Folsom points and bison antiquus remains suggests a specialized hunting adaptation. In the Great Basin and adjacent regions, the post-Clovis period saw the development of stemmed point traditions that differed substantially from the fluted point technologies of the plains. The Western stemmed tradition, represented at sites including the Paisley Caves and numerous localities across the Great Basin, produced points with contracting or notched stems designed for hafting and relatively simple flaking patterns compared to Clovis or Folsom. Whether the Western stemmed tradition developed independently of Clovis or represents a separate technological lineage with distinct origins is debated. Some researchers have argued that the co-occurrence of Western stemmed points with pre-Clovis dates at Paisley suggests that multiple technological traditions were present on the continent simultaneously during the terminal Pleistocene. Groundstone technology represents a distinct and economically important technological domain that developed and intensified through the Archaic period across much of the continent. Manos and metates, the paired grinding stones used to process seeds and other plant foods, appear in the archaeological record of the Great Basin and adjacent regions by at least 9,000 years before present, and become increasingly common through the Middle and Late Holocene as plant food dependence intensified. Manos are handheld grinding stones moved back and forth across the surface of a metate, a larger stationary lower grinding stone. The repeated use of these tools wore characteristic grooves or basins into the metate surface and rounded or faceted the mano. The degree of wear on groundstone artifacts can provide information about the intensity of use and, by extension, the relative importance of plant food processing in a given assemblage. Mortars and pestles represent a related but distinct groundstone technology, particularly associated with acorn processing in California and adjacent regions. Unlike the back-and-forth motion used with manos and metates, mortars are used with a pounding motion, breaking down hard food items including acorns, seeds, and dried meat. Bedrock mortars, cup-shaped depressions ground into exposed rock outcrops, are found in abundance across the California landscape and indicate locations where plant processing was carried out repeatedly, often over long periods. The spatial distribution of bedrock mortars correlates with productive oak woodlands, and clusters of mortars at specific outcrops suggest that these locations were used by groups gathering to process harvests collectively. Bone and antler tools are preserved at many prehistoric sites, particularly in contexts where alkaline soil chemistry, waterlogging, or other preserving conditions inhibited organic decomposition. Bone awls, used in the production of basketry and hideworking, are among the most common bone tool forms across a wide range of sites and periods. Bone needles, indicating the production of sewn clothing or other assembled fiber or hide goods, appear in assemblages dating to the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. Antler was used to produce pressure-flaking tools for stone knapping, shaft straighteners, and various forms of composite tool components. Worked bone and antler artifacts from sites such as Lindenmeyer and various Pacific coastal shell middens demonstrate the sophistication of organic tool production, even in periods from which the broader technological record is sparse. Watercraft technology, though rarely preserved directly in the archaeological record, can be inferred from the distribution of human populations and materials across water barriers. The presence of humans on the California Channel Islands by at least 13,000 years before present implies the use of watercraft capable of crossing open water channels. Along the Pacific Northwest coast, the richness and productivity of the maritime subsistence economy that developed through the Holocene required boats for fishing, sea mammal hunting, and the movement of people and goods along the coast. Dugout canoes, plank canoes, and skin boats are all documented ethnographically in various coastal regions, and each technology would leave distinct and limited archaeological signatures. Waterlogged site contexts have occasionally preserved fragments of wooden watercraft, but these finds are rare. Projectile technology underwent significant changes through the prehistoric sequence. The atlatl, a handheld wooden shaft with a hook or spur at one end, used to extend the effective throwing arm and increase the velocity and force of a thrown dart, was the primary projectile delivery system across much of North America through much of the prehistoric period. Atlatl weights, also called banner stones or boat stones, are found at sites across the eastern United States and adjacent regions, and are interpreted as counterweights that improved the efficiency or balance of the throwing device. The bow and arrow appears in the North American archaeological record at different times in different regions, generally within the last 2,000 to 1,500 years before present, across most of the continent. Though earlier appearances are documented in some areas, the transition from atlatl to bow is marked in the archaeological record by a shift towards smaller, lighter projectile points, as the bow delivers a lighter projectile at high velocity rather than the heavier dart of the atlatl system. This shift in point size and form is one of the most consistent technological markers used to identify the adoption of bow technology in regional sequences. Basketry and textile production, though organic and therefore rarely preserved, were technologically sophisticated and economically significant. Dry cave sites in the Great Basin and the Southwest have produced basketry dating to 9,000 years before present and earlier, demonstrating that fiber technology was well developed by the early Holocene. Baskets served as containers for water, food storage, and food processing, and in some regions, waterproofed baskets were used for stone boiling, a cooking technique in which heated stones are placed into a liquid-filled basket to bring the contents to a boil. The diversity of weaving techniques, materials, and forms visible even in early basketry assemblages indicates that fiber technology had a long developmental history preceding the earliest preserved examples. The climate of North America during the prehistoric period was not a stable background condition, but an active variable that repeatedly reorganized the environments within which human populations lived and to which they were required to adapt. Understanding the trajectory of climate change across the late Pleistocene and Holocene is essential to interpreting shifts in settlement patterns, subsistence strategies, population distributions, and technological developments visible in the archaeological record. Paleoclimatic data drawn from ice cores, pollen sequences, lake sediment records, speleothems, tree rings, and other proxy sources has substantially refined understanding of the timing, magnitude, and regional expression of climate change across the continent over the past 20,000 years. At the last glacial maximum, approximately 26,000 to 19,000 years before present, conditions across much of North America were substantially colder and in many regions drier than today. The Laurentide ice sheet covered the northern portion of the continent to depths of several kilometers in places, depressing the underlying bedrock through isostatic loading and fundamentally restructuring drainage systems across a vast area. South of the ice margin, periglacial conditions prevailed across a broad zone, with permafrost extending into regions that are temperate today. Vegetation zones were compressed southward. The boreal forest zone that today occupies much of Canada was pushed into what is now the northern United States. Grasslands and steppe environments extended across areas that now support deciduous forest. In the Southwest and Great Basin, cooler and, in some areas, wetter conditions supported plant communities that no longer exist in those regions, including woodland associations at elevations now occupied by desert scrub. The deglaciation that followed the last glacial maximum was a protracted and regionally variable process. Initial warming began around 19,000 years before present, but ice sheet retreat was neither linear nor uniform. The southern margin of the Laurentide ice sheet began retreating northward, exposing newly deglaciated land that was initially barren and ecologically unstable. Pioneer plant communities colonized these surfaces gradually, with soil development and ecological succession proceeding over centuries to millennia. The pace of ecological recovery after deglaciation influenced how quickly newly exposed landscapes could support human populations, as productive ecosystems capable of sustaining huntable game and harvestable plant foods required time to establish. The Younger Dryas event, dated to approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years before present, represents one of the most significant climatic reversals of the deglaciation sequence. During the Younger Dryas, temperatures in the North Atlantic region and adjacent areas dropped sharply, returning to near glacial conditions over a period of decades. The mechanism most widely accepted for this reversal involves disruption of Atlantic Ocean circulation patterns by the influx of large volumes of cold freshwater from melting ice sheets, potentially including catastrophic drainage of glacial lakes into the North Atlantic. The Younger Dryas cooling was most pronounced in the North Atlantic region and northwestern Europe, but had detectable effects across much of the Northern Hemisphere, including North America. In the Great Lakes region and northeastern North America, cooling was significant. In the Southwest and Great Basin, the Younger Dryas is associated with increased effective moisture in some areas, reflecting the complex and regionally differentiated nature of the climatic response. The end of the Younger Dryas around 11,700 years before present marked the transition to the Holocene epoch. This transition involved rapid warming, with temperature increases of several degrees occurring over periods as short as decades in some proxy records. The speed of this warming transition was sufficient to drive rapid reorganization of plant communities, animal distributions, and hydrological systems across the continent. For human populations already present on the continent, this transition represented a significant environmental disruption requiring behavioral adjustment. The megafauna extinctions that marked the terminal Pleistocene coincided broadly with this climatic transition, though, as previously noted, the relative contributions of climate change, habitat disruption, and human hunting to the extinction event remain debated. The early Holocene, roughly 11,700 to 8,000 years before present, was characterized across much of the continent by continued warming and by significant reorganization of biotic communities as plant and animal species tracked shifting climate envelopes. In the eastern United States, deciduous forest expanded northward into previously glaciated territory. In the Great Plains, grasslands expanded and contracted in response to precipitation variability. In the Southwest, effective moisture levels fluctuated, affecting the availability of water sources and the distribution of resources critical to human subsistence. Human populations across the continent adapted to these changing conditions through shifts in settlement patterns, subsistence emphasis, and technological repertoires, though the specific responses varied by region according to local ecological trajectories. The mid-Holocene hypsothermal, or altithermal period, roughly 9,000 to 5,000 years before present, brought warmer and in many continental interior regions significantly drier conditions than either earlier or later periods. This interval is particularly well documented in the Great Plains, where evidence from lake sediment records, pollen sequences, and dune activity indicates episodes of severe drought and reduced vegetation cover. The archaeological record of the Great Plains shows a notable reduction in site density during portions of the altithermal, which has been interpreted as evidence of reduced human population levels or population displacement from the plains interior during the most severe drought phases. Whether the plains were substantially depopulated or simply occupied at lower densities with higher residential mobility during these periods is debated, as reduced archaeological visibility during periods of high mobility could produce patterns similar to actual depopulation. In the Great Basin, the altithermal brought drying conditions that reduced lake levels, contracted wetland environments, and shifted the distribution of productive plant communities. Lakes that had been substantially larger during the late Pleistocene, including pluvial lakes whose former extents are marked by shoreline terraces visible across the basin today, contracted significantly during the mid-Holocene. The reduction of lacustrine and wetland resources would have placed stress on human populations dependent on these environments, potentially forcing range expansion, intensification of upland resources, or increased intergroup exchange to buffer against local shortfalls. Archaeological evidence from the Great Basin indicates shifts in site distributions during the altithermal consistent with responses to reduced lowland productivity. Along the Pacific coast of California, mid-Holocene climate was characterized by warmer sea surface temperatures that reduced the productivity of nearshore marine environments through effects on upwelling patterns. Reduced marine productivity during this interval is reflected in some coastal archaeological sequences as a shift in the composition of faunal assemblages, with changes in the relative abundance of different fish species and marine invertebrates. These shifts in resource availability appear to have influenced settlement patterns and subsistence emphases along the coast, though the degree to which mid-Holocene marine productivity decline affected human populations remains a subject of ongoing research. The late Holocene, beginning approximately 4,000 to 3,000 years before present, brought climatic conditions closer to those of the present day in many regions, though significant variability continued. In the Southwest, the late Holocene included episodes of severe multi-decadal drought that had profound effects on agricultural populations in the region. Dendrochronological records, derived from tree ring sequences preserved in archaeological wood from southwestern sites, provide exceptionally high-resolution records of precipitation variability during the last 2 millennia. These records document repeated drought episodes of sufficient severity and duration to stress agricultural systems and potentially trigger population movements, site abandonments, and social reorganization. The abandonment of major site clusters in the northern Southwest during the late 13th century, a phenomenon visible across a wide area, coincides with one of the most severe drought episodes documented in the tree ring record. In the eastern United States, the late Holocene was a period of increasing effective moisture in many regions, supporting the expansion of productive floodplain environments and contributing to conditions favorable for population growth and social complexity in the Mississippi River drainage and adjacent areas. The medieval warm period, roughly 900 to 1300 years before present, and the subsequent Little Ice Age cooling are both detectable in proxy records from eastern North America and have been invoked to explain aspects of the archaeological record from this period, including the florescence and subsequent decline of Mississippian chiefdom societies. The relationships between climatic episodes and cultural trajectories during this period are actively studied, but remain incompletely understood, as the mechanisms linking climate variability to social and political change are complex and mediated by many intervening variables. The overall pattern of Holocene climate in North America was one of persistent variability superimposed on longer-term trends. No extended period of true climatic stability can be identified in the proxy record. Prehistoric human populations were not responding to a fixed environmental background, but to an environment that was itself continuously changing on timescales ranging from annual precipitation variability to multi-century shifts in temperature and moisture regimes. The archaeological evidence for repeated adjustments in settlement patterns, subsistence strategies, and technological investments across the prehistoric sequence reflects this ongoing negotiation between human adaptive capacities and an environment that consistently presented new challenges and opportunities. The continental expanse of North America encompasses environments so varied that no single adaptive strategy could serve human populations across all of them. As the Holocene progressed and populations became more firmly established in specific regions, distinct regional cultural traditions emerged that reflected long-term accommodation to local ecological conditions. These traditions differed in settlement patterns, subsistence emphases, technological repertoires, and social organization. The divergence between regional traditions accelerated through the Middle and Late Holocene as populations grew. Territories became more clearly defined, and the cumulative effect of generations of localized adaptation produced increasingly differentiated cultural landscapes. The Pacific coast of North America, from southeastern Alaska to the tip of Baja California, supported some of the most productive marine and estuarine environments on the continent. Cold, nutrient-rich waters driven by upwelling along the California coast supported exceptionally diverse and abundant marine life, including fish, marine mammals, shellfish, and seabirds. The productivity of these environments allowed coastal populations to sustain relatively high densities compared to most interior regions, and supported degrees of sedentism unusual among non-agricultural populations. Along the northern Pacific coast, the combination of rich marine resources with productive riverine salmon runs created conditions for particularly dense and complex societies. The archaeological sequence along the Pacific Northwest coast documents a long trajectory of increasing sedentism, growing site size, accumulation of stored food surpluses, and elaboration of material culture extending back several millennia before contact. Evidence of substantial semi-permanent or permanent villages along the northwest coast dates to at least 5,000 years before present at some localities, with earlier evidence of intensive marine resource use extending further back in the sequence. The development of large plank houses, communal structures housing multiple family groups, is documented archaeologically through post-molds, hearth distributions, and in some cases preserved structural wood in waterlogged deposits. These architectural investments indicate commitment to specific locations and the social organization necessary to construct and maintain large communal structures. The accumulation of food surpluses through intensive salmon processing and storage created an economic foundation for social differentiation, as groups or individuals controlling access to productive fishing locations or possessing the labor and organizational capacity to process large quantities of fish could accumulate wealth in the form of stored food and the social obligations that food distribution generated. The California region, bounded by the Pacific coast to the west, the Sierra Nevada to the east, and desert environments to the south, supported a remarkably diverse array of prehistoric adaptations. Within a relatively compact geographic area, coastal, valley, foothill, and montane environments offered different resource bases exploited through different technological and organizational strategies. The archaeological sequence in California spans more than 13,000 years, with the earliest evidence of human presence on the Channel Islands, followed by a long sequence of changing adaptations across the mainland. The Millingstone Horizon, an early to middle Holocene cultural pattern identified across coastal and inland Southern California, is characterized by abundant groundstone implements and relatively few projectile points, suggesting a subsistence economy heavily oriented toward plant food processing, with less emphasis on large game hunting than some contemporaneous inland traditions. Through the Middle and Late Holocene, California populations increasingly focused subsistence economies on acorn dependence, where oak woodlands were productive. This intensification of acorn use was associated with population growth, reduced residential mobility, and the development of storage facilities capable of holding large quantities of processed acorn meal. The social implications of acorn dependence were significant. Productive oak groves required long-term management and generated social claims to specific resource patches. Groups or families with established access to productive groves occupied advantaged positions relative to those without such access. The development of more formalized territorial boundaries and associated social mechanisms for managing access to productive resources is reflected in late prehistoric California archaeological assemblages through changes in site distributions, the elaboration of exchange systems, and evidence of increased intergroup conflict in some regions. The Great Basin, the large internal drainage basin between the Sierra Nevada and the Rocky Mountains, presented some of the most challenging conditions for prehistoric human subsistence on the continent. Annual precipitation was low, surface water was scarce and unevenly distributed, and the productive plant and animal communities of adjacent regions were largely absent from the basin interior. Despite these constraints, the Great Basin was not uninhabited. Archaeological evidence documents human presence in the region from the terminal Pleistocene onward, with a subsistence economy based on broad exploitation of available resources, including pronghorn, deer, rabbits, fish where accessible, and an extensive range of plant foods including pine nuts, seeds, roots, and berries. The Great Basin Archaic, a long cultural period spanning most of the Holocene, is characterized by high residential mobility, small group sizes, and a technological emphasis on groundstone processing of plant foods and the hunting of small to medium game. Rabbit drives, in which groups cooperated to drive jackrabbits and cottontails into long nets strung across the landscape, were an important communal hunting strategy in the Great Basin. The nets used in rabbit drives were constructed from plant fiber cordage and could extend for hundreds of meters. Their production required substantial labor investment and the cooperative effort of multiple family groups. Rabbit drives served not only as subsistence events, but as occasions for social aggregation, exchange, and the maintenance of social ties between groups that spent much of the year dispersed across the landscape. The rabbits taken in these drives provided meat, fat, and fur for robes and blankets, essential for winter warmth in the cold basin nights. The Columbia Plateau, lying between the Rocky Mountains and the Cascade Range in the interior Pacific Northwest, supported a subsistence economy centered heavily on anadromous fish, particularly salmon and steelhead. The Columbia River and its tributaries provided access to salmon runs of enormous abundance during seasonal migrations. Plateau groups developed fishing technologies, including weirs, dip nets, and platforms over productive fishing locations, and engaged in intensive processing and drying of fish for winter storage. The combination of productive fisheries with hunting of deer and elk in adjacent uplands and gathering of camas bulbs and other plant foods across the plateau created a diverse and relatively reliable subsistence base. The plateau archaeological sequence documents increasing sedentism and site elaboration through the late Holocene as population densities grew and territorial boundaries became more defined, the Southwest encompassing the Colorado Plateau, the Rio Grande drainage, and adjacent desert basins in what are now Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, presents one of the most archaeologically intensively studied regions in North America. The dry conditions that prevail across much of the region create exceptional preservation conditions for organic materials, including wood, fiber, botanical remains, and occasionally textiles and other perishable items. The long sequence of prehistoric occupation in the Southwest, extending from Clovis Age sites through the development of agricultural villages and ultimately to the complex pueblo societies of the late prehistoric period, has been documented in extraordinary detail through more than a century of systematic excavation. The introduction of maize agriculture into the Southwest, derived ultimately from Mesoamerican origins, began in some areas as early as 4,000 years before present, though the earliest maize was small-cobbed and of limited productivity. The adoption and intensification of agriculture proceeded gradually and unevenly across the region, with different groups integrating maize cultivation into existing foraging economies at different rates and to different degrees. By the early centuries of the Common Era, agricultural villages with permanent architecture were established across much of the northern Southwest. The ancestral Puebloan tradition, centered on the Colorado Plateau, developed through the first millennium of the Common Era into a regionally integrated cultural system with distinctive architectural forms including above-ground masonry structures, underground ceremonial chambers known as kivas, and eventually the large multi-story pueblo complexes visible at sites including Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. The eastern woodlands encompassed a vast region of deciduous and mixed forest, extending from the Atlantic coast westward to the prairie edge, and from the Great Lakes southward to the Gulf coastal plain. The subsistence resources of this region were diverse and productive, including deer, turkey, waterfowl, fish, shellfish in coastal areas, and an extensive range of nut-producing trees, including oak, hickory, chestnut, and walnut. The Eastern Woodlands archaeological sequence documents a long trajectory from early archaic mobile foraging through increasing sedentism, the development of mound-building traditions, experimentation with, and eventual adoption of agriculture, and ultimately the emergence of complex chiefdom societies in the late prehistoric period. The diversity of environments within the Eastern Woodlands produced significant regional variation in this trajectory, with different areas developing distinct cultural traditions while maintaining connections through extensive exchange networks. The southeastern coastal plain and adjacent Piedmont supported populations exploiting rich estuarine and coastal resources alongside interior forest game and plant foods. The interior southeast, particularly the river valleys draining into the Gulf of Mexico and the Mississippi drainage, developed some of the earliest evidence of mound construction and social complexity in eastern North America. The shift from predominantly mobile foraging to more sedentary village life proceeded at different rates in different parts of the eastern woodlands, driven by local variations in resource productivity, population density, and the specific trajectories of agricultural adoption. In the north, wild plant and animal resources remained the primary subsistence base into the contact period in many areas, while in the south and in the major river valleys, agricultural production became increasingly central to subsistence economies during the last millennium before European contact. The archaeological evidence for social complexity in prehistoric North America is varied in its forms, unevenly distributed across regions and time periods, and subject to ongoing interpretive debate. Social complexity as a concept encompasses several related but distinct phenomena, including the emergence of social differentiation between individuals and groups, the development of hereditary or achieved leadership roles, the institutionalization of mechanisms for surplus accumulation and redistribution, the elaboration of ceremonial and mortuary practices, and the organization of collective labor for construction and other large-scale undertakings. Not all of these phenomena necessarily co-occur, and their presence and intensity varied considerably across prehistoric North American societies. Mortuary practices represent one of the most informative archaeological windows into prehistoric social organization. The treatment of the dead, including the location and form of burial, the presence and quantity of grave goods, and evidence of differential treatment between individuals, provides information about how societies conceptualized social categories, valued particular individuals or groups, and invested resources in mortuary ritual. At the most basic level, the presence of intentional burial itself indicates that human remains were treated as socially significant rather than simply discarded. The elaboration of mortuary ritual beyond simple interment, including the inclusion of grave goods, the use of ochre or other colorants, the construction of burial mounds, or the practice of secondary burial involving the reprocessing of skeletal remains after initial decomposition, suggests investment of social and material resources in mortuary contexts that goes beyond purely practical concerns. The earliest evidence of elaborated mortuary treatment in North America dates to the Archaic period. The Windover site in Florida, a pond site dating to approximately 7,000 to 8,000 years before present, preserved skeletal remains of over 160 individuals in waterlogged peat deposits, along with associated organic materials, including textiles, wooden artifacts, and plant remains. The preservation at Windover was exceptional, with brain tissue surviving in some crania and yielding ancient DNA. The burials showed evidence of careful placement, and in some cases the inclusion of grave goods, indicating that mortuary ritual was practiced by these early archaic populations. Significantly, the skeletal assemblage at Windover showed evidence of healed injuries and pathological conditions that would have required long-term care, suggesting that individuals who were unable to contribute fully to subsistence activities were supported by their social groups. The Old Copper Complex of the Upper Great Lakes region, dating broadly to between 7,000 and 3,000 years before present, represents an early and technically sophisticated tradition of cold hammering native copper into tools and ornaments. Native copper deposits in the Lake Superior region were exploited to produce spear points, knives, axes, fishhooks, awls, and a range of ornamental forms, including beads, pendants, and bracelets. The distribution of old copper artifacts across the Great Lakes region and into adjacent areas indicates that copper objects moved through exchange networks over considerable distances. The appearance of copper artifacts as grave goods in mortuary contexts suggests that they carried social significance beyond their utilitarian value, potentially marking the status or identity of their owners. The Old Copper Complex represents one of the earliest traditions of metal working in the world, predating the development of copper metallurgy in many Old World contexts, though the North American tradition involved cold working of native metal rather than smelting. The Poverty Point site in northeastern Louisiana, dating to approximately 3,700 to 3,100 years before present, represents a remarkable concentration of monumental earthwork construction and long-distance exchange in the late Archaic period of the lower Mississippi Valley. Poverty Point consists of a series of concentric earthen ridges arranged in a roughly semicircular pattern, along with several large earthen mounds, all constructed through the movement of enormous quantities of soil without the use of draft animals or wheeled vehicles. The scale of construction at Poverty Point implies the organization of substantial collective labor over extended periods, which in turn implies some form of leadership or coordination mechanism capable of directing that labor. The site also yielded evidence of extensive long-distance exchange, with materials including chert from the Ouachita Mountains, copper from the Great Lakes region, galena from the upper Mississippi Valley, and steatite from the Appalachian region, all represented in the artifact assemblage. The concentration of exotic materials at Poverty Point suggests that it functioned as a major node in regional exchange networks, and that its inhabitants or leaders had the social connections and organizational capacity to attract materials from sources hundreds of kilometers distant. The Hopewell tradition of the eastern woodlands, centered in the Ohio and Illinois river valleys and dating broadly from approximately 100 BCE to 500 CE, represents the most elaborate expression of mortuary ceremonialism and long-distance exchange in the prehistoric eastern United States. Hopewell mortuary sites include large geometric earthwork enclosures, burial mounds containing multiple interments, and assemblages of exotic grave goods that include copper from the Great Lakes, obsidian from the Yellowstone region, mica from the southern Appalachians, shark teeth and marine shell from the Gulf Coast, and effigy pipes carved from Ohio pipestone. The geographic range from which these materials were drawn, spanning much of the eastern half of the continent, indicates a sphere of interaction and exchange of extraordinary extent. The concentration of exotic materials in specific burial contexts, often associated with elaborately prepared central tombs within mounds, indicates that access to prestige goods was differentially distributed and that mortuary ritual served to express and perhaps reinforce social distinctions. Whether Hopewell societies were organized as chiefdoms with hereditary leadership and institutionalized inequality, or as more fluid systems in which achieved status and ritual specialization conferred prestige without hereditary entrenchment, is debated among researchers. The evidence for permanent hereditary social hierarchy in Hopewell contexts is not unambiguous. Some researchers emphasize the concentration of exotic goods in specific burials as evidence of marked social differentiation. Others point to the relatively limited evidence for differences in everyday consumption or residential architecture as indicators that social differentiation in Hopewell contexts was primarily expressed in the mortuary sphere rather than in daily life. The interpretation of Hopewell social organization continues to be refined as new excavation and analytical data accumulate. Evidence of interpersonal and intergroup violence in prehistoric North America is documented across multiple regions and time periods, though its frequency, scale, and social context varied considerably. Skeletal evidence represents the most direct indicator of prehistoric violence. Perimortem trauma, injuries occurring at or around the time of death and distinguishable from postmortem damage by the nature of bone response, can indicate lethal violence. Healed injuries indicate that individuals survived violent encounters. The frequency of traumatic injuries in skeletal assemblages varies considerably across sites and periods. Some assemblages show little evidence of violence, while others document high frequencies of cranial injuries, embedded projectile points, or other trauma consistent with interpersonal conflict. The Crow Creek site in South Dakota, a Middle Missouri tradition village dating to approximately 1325 CE, provides some of the most dramatic evidence of prehistoric violence in North America. Excavations at Crow Creek revealed a mass burial containing the commingled skeletal remains of approximately 486 individuals, representing a substantial portion of what is estimated to have been a village population of several hundred people. The skeletal remains showed extensive evidence of perimortem trauma, including scalping marks, dismemberment, and blunt force injuries. Many of the individuals had been scalped both before and after death. The remains had been deposited in a large ossuary pit, suggesting that survivors returned to collect and rebury the remains of the dead after a massacre event. The Crow Creek Massacre, as it has come to be known, occurred during a period of climatic stress associated with drought conditions on the northern plains, and researchers have interpreted it within a context of resource competition and intergroup conflict intensified by environmental pressure. Fortification of village sites represents another form of evidence for intergroup conflict. The presence of defensive ditches, palisade walls, and site locations on defensible landforms such as promontories or bluffs, surrounded by steep slopes, indicates that village inhabitants anticipated and prepared for attack. Fortified village sites appear in the archaeological record of multiple regions, including the northern plains, the eastern woodlands, and the southwest during the late prehistoric period. The investment required to construct and maintain fortifications was substantial, indicating that the perceived threat of attack was significant enough to justify significant labor expenditure for defensive purposes. The distribution of fortified sites through time and space is not random. Fortification tends to cluster in periods and regions where other evidence also suggests elevated conflict levels, including high frequencies of skeletal trauma and evidence of site abandonment and population displacement. Shell bead currencies represent a form of evidence for economic complexity and potentially for the emergence of more formalized exchange systems in certain regions. Along the California coast and in adjacent interior regions, beads manufactured from the shells of specific species, particularly the olivella shell, were produced in large quantities and distributed through exchange networks across substantial geographic areas. The standardization of bead forms, the evidence for specialized production at certain sites, and the quantities in which beads appear in mortuary and other archaeological contexts all suggest that shell beads functioned as a medium of exchange with relatively standardized value rather than simply as ornamental objects. The Chumash peoples of the Santa Barbara Channel region are documented ethnographically as operating a shell bead currency system of considerable complexity, and the archaeological antecedents of this system extend back several centuries into the prehistoric period. Similar shell bead exchange systems, though varying in specific form and geographic extent, are documented in other coastal regions. The emergence of leadership structures more formal than the situational leadership typical of band-level societies is evidenced in multiple regions by the late prehistoric period. In the Pacific Northwest, hereditary leadership associated with control over productive resource locations and the capacity to host large redistributive feasts is reflected archaeologically in the elaboration of residential architecture, differential distributions of prestige goods, and evidence of craft specialization. In the Southeast and Mississippi Valley, the Mississippian tradition that developed after approximately 800 CE produced some of the most clearly hierarchical societies documented in prehistoric North America, with platform mound construction, evidence of chiefly redistribution of prestige goods, and in some cases skeletal evidence of human sacrifice associated with elite mortuary ritual. The degree of social stratification in Mississippian societies and the mechanisms by which chiefly authority was maintained and transmitted are subjects of ongoing research and debate.